welcome to the 10th episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we are going to be discussing the Pittsburgh Panthers, in particular, their probability of making a bowl game in the 2024 season. Now, Pittsburgh Panthers hold a special place in my heart, mainly for a multitude of reasons, but the main one is a lot of family on my dad's side all grew up in Pittsburgh, and I guess I call myself a Steelers fan pretty much. So, over the years I've tried to follow the Pittsburgh Panthers as much as I can, and especially since the last episode we discussed Clemson, I thought it'd be pretty fitting to put some highlight on Pittsburgh and elaborate a little bit more in terms of how realistic it is for them to make a bowl game this year. Now, there definitely are some pros and cons, and I'm going to elaborate a little bit on that, but we're going to talk about the positives first. Obviously, last season, nobody wants to see them go 3-9. Definitely had some heartbreaking losses here and there, but there definitely is a lot more positive than people would think in terms of Pittsburgh. To me, the greatest positive I see right now in Pittsburgh is, twofold. One, I love Pat Narduzzi. I think he's a great coach. I think he's a fierce leader. And quite frankly, I'm glad that Pittsburgh is sticking with him right now, because I don't think Pittsburgh needs to completely relaunch everybody and redo everything in terms of the back office, the AD staff, and all that. Now, I'll get to the offense, restructure the offense a little bit, but right now I think it's a great positive that Pat Narduzzi is still at the helm. And to elaborate, outside of Pat Narduzzi, I would also like to point out that in terms of Pittsburgh's ACC schedule, they really do avoid a lot of the big hitters of the ACC. Now, granted, when you look at their schedule, obviously you have they have the Backyard Bowl every year versus West Virginia, and the one tough game that I particularly noticed that's going to be pretty stressful is they do have to go down to Chapel Hill and play North Carolina. But when I look at this schedule, I say to myself, you don't have to play Miami, you don't have to play Virginia Tech, you don't have to play Virginia Tech, you don't have to play Miami, you do have to play Clemson. So there's a lot of the big teams that you're quite frankly having to miss out on. You don't really have to worry about playing at all. And you don't this is the other team I'm thinking of. You don't have to play Florida State either. I was thinking to myself, I'm missing every team but Florida State. So in terms of the schedule, I think quite frankly it fares pretty well for them. Now, granted, they're going to have to play new ACC team SMU. Do they play UCal? Yeah, fortunately, they don't have to travel to UCal. So I think that's another great positive. So when I look at the schedule, I'm saying to myself, okay, they're avoiding the majority of the quote-unquote elite ACC teams. And in terms of traveling, I'm not really seeing too many problems. I mean, you get Clemson at home. Granted, you got to go to Louisville and Boston College, but you get the Backyard Bowl home. You get UCal home, and you get Clemson home. So when I see that schedule, I'm thinking to myself, are they going to win the ACC championship this year? No, I don't think they need to. But I think if you can get somewhere, I would like to see them make it to a bowl game. Do I think they can make it to a bowl game? Possibly, but it's really going to come down to how that offense looks. And when I think about the offense, I think that's one of the things I'm very much concerned about in terms of how much can they really improve from that 3-9 season last year. Because even, just take a quick drive-by of kind of Pittsburgh last 10 years, aside from their last year with Kenny Pickett, which they went 11-3 in and lost in the Peach Bowl, their only other 10-win season was back in 2009. Yeah, because you take a look here and pretty much averaging out 6 to 7 wins every year. Now, I'm not saying that should be the standard at Pitt, But what I'm saying is a 6-win season this year is, yes, I guess it could be quote unquote the standard, but not every 6-win season looks that way on paper. Like, I think a 6-6 win this season would be a huge monumental accomplishment, especially compared to what you kind of saw last year. Granted they did have an upset victory or two, but for the most part though, I mean you gotta think to yourself, well, we gotta see at least 5 or 6 wins this year. I think they can get the 6, but I think they're gonna have to upset somebody if you really want to get the 6 this year. Now back to what my concerns are. Now I did watch the spring game, and I think from what I see, I think Nate Yardall is going to end up being the starter. I know there was conversations about maybe Christian Vielix getting another chance after kind of those 5 starts where he really struggled. And I know like Eli Horstein was kind of the sort of incumbent kind of coming into the spring game. But I think the one thing that was apparent from watching the spring game is I think there obviously was some chemistry between Nate and all of the offense, and I know they brought a new offensive coordinator, Cade Bell, who is only 31 too, so he's definitely a young gun, but he spent the last 3 years over at Western Carolina coaching with his father, Kerwin. So it will be interesting. Now I'm not sitting here and saying that Western Carolina set the world on fire with being in the FCS and everything. Granted, their best season was I believe 7-4 because they still play 11 games in the FCS. And also, Western Carolina historically wasn't always the greatest program either. I think a lot of things changed when the two sort of bells kind of came in together. And I think I do think the overall thought or idea eventually, which Nardizzi elaborates a little bit this in the post conference, after the bowl game, after the spring game and everything. But one thing that does stand out to me is kind of compared to sort of Pittsburgh teams of the past, it seems quite evident to me that Pittsburgh is going to be, I think it's going to be more pass heavy than we've seen in the past couple seasons. And I do also want to add that I think it's going to be a lot more tempo focused, especially, I do want to take some time and watch Western Carolina offensive last year just to kind of get a little bit of a better idea in terms of what we'll really be seeing. Now, granted, the spring game you got to take it with a grain of salt too, because at the end of the day, I do think the defense is ultimately the pillar of Pittsburgh football. But yet again, especially when in a spring game where the communication might not be there, you might be learning the coverages still, all that kind of stuff, and you're seeing multiple different quarterbacks, so it's really kind of hard to sit there and get one consistent sort of view in terms of the defense, who by the way is definitely the strength of the team 100%. So that's why my focus hesitancy is on the offense right now. In general, it's just, I think the tempo is definitely going to be up, but I just don't, when I look at this team, I just don't know if I could sit there and say that they're going to have that explosiveness and that sort of dynamic, look that you need to have in order for them to really kind of get over the hump and get to a bowl game this year. Because if they have any chance at winning 5 or 6 games this year, they really can't afford they really can't afford an upset loss to a Virginia or a Syracuse, or those games are going to be tight and they really kind of have to win those. Now, granted, when you look at the schedule too, I mean, Luke Fickell at Cincinnati, they're probably one of the most underrated programs in the entire country. I think North Carolina is going to be a pretty tough game. I think West Virginia you have to have. Fortunately, they have Youngstown State before they kind of get into the ACC schedule, so there is kind of a little bit of a pillar there. But you see Boston College too. By the time you get to that finale, you're going to kind of get an idea of how Bill O'Brien's Boston College team looks and everything. But I think really what this comes down to is, quite frankly, the Pittsburgh offense last year, it was anemic, it was boring, it was hard to watch, and I do think kind of similar to how I kind of sort of elaborated with Florida, I think they're going to have to lean on that running game a little bit more. So what I'm curious about from, sort of a schematic sort of perspective is, I know the idea at Western Carolina was to kind of move the ball, be fast-paced, kind of catch the defense off guard. Yet, historically speaking, let's just talk outside of Kenny Pickett. A lot of the bread and butter was, winning the trenches, having that power running back. I think of James. When I go back and think of James Conner and all those dudes. But I think what this really kind of my sentiment here is really how much they get to run the ball, because I think in order for this offense to really work, I think Pittsburgh's gonna have to lean on running the ball a lot more than I think what we kind of saw in the spring game. So there are kind of a lot of elements here, but I think ultimately, do I think Pittsburgh can make it to 6 wins? Yeah, but I certainly think you're stretching. But I do think, for the most part, I'd say the majority of their games on this schedule are winnable games, and they are going to be close. That's why the ACC, outside of kind of the top guys, a lot of, sort of those middle teams are, kind of in between that, 5 to 8 win threshold, which is kind of what we've seen historically at Pittsburgh. But I think this year what makes it different is if they made it to a bowl game this year, that would be a huge turnaround compared to the 3-9 we saw last year, and especially compared to the offense that we saw before. Now, granted, I think they had to see something in Cade Bell. I still think 3 seasons at Western Carolina, I still think you're a little bit unproven. However, I do think that I think Pat probably sat there and said to himself, hey, we are going to have to kind of spice this up a little bit, and we're going to have to do something a little different if we want to keep building a sustained program who can get to 8 wins consistently a season, and can make some noise in the ACC championship. So ultimately, the bread and butter is really going to come down to how much can Pittsburgh really move the ball, how much can they control the trenches, and to what extent is that transition for Cade Bell's offense going from the FCS to the FBS really going to work? Because at the end of the day, the ACC is Power 5 football, and it is one of the most competitive conferences in all of college football.